Hi, everyone. My name is Chantay Jett, and I'm the Executive Director for Wallowa Valley Center for Wellness, located in Wallowa County. We serve the community for any mental health and substance use disorder needs, as well as developmental disabilities programs. I am here today along with the Dougy Center and Jana, who is going to talk to you a little bit about the support that we want to offer any community members, from children to adults, who may be suffering with some grief issues. We've had some really big changes over this past year with COVID and transitioning into sort of this new Zoom world, as well as many of us have suffered some pretty significant losses in our own personal lives. And so we're just here to sort of reach out and see if we can be of service to you and bring you some additional resources through the Dougy Center. Jana, do you want to talk more about that?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Chantay. And thank you for having me here today to talk with you and to hopefully share some information with your community members. And as you mentioned, I'm from Dougy Center, which is the National Grief Center for children and families who are grieving. We are located in Portland, Oregon. We actually have 3 locations: Portland, and then on the west side of the metro area in the Beaverton-Hillsboro area, and also a little south of Portland Metro in Canby. And we were the first grief support center for kids and teens that we are aware of in North America. So we were founded in 1982, and we started offering groups, peer support groups for kids and teens who'd had a parent, a sibling, or a primary caregiver die. We started with 4 kids in a basement in a house in Southeast Portland. And from then we've grown into a program with 3 locations. And we serve about, pre-pandemic times, we had about 550 kids and teens walking through our doors every month. Since the pandemic hit in March of 2020, feels like so long ago, we transitioned to all virtual services. So we're currently providing Zoom grief support groups for kids anywhere from the ages of 3 to 18, as well as their adult caregivers and young adults who were ages 18 to 25 and 26 to 40. So that's our main local program. But we do provide training and consultation for communities like yourselves all around the country and all around the world. And we have a variety of free resources on our website. We have tip sheets, we have podcast episodes, we have activity sheets, we have workbooks, all kinds of things that families can turn to when someone in their life has died, to support kids and teens.
Fantastic, Jana. Thank you so much for kind of laying out that environment of support that you offer, and really exciting that you're able to serve so many kids and families throughout the region. When I think about grief, there are so many different ways a person grieves, it seems. And especially culturally in the US, we don't really have any formalized grief systems, if you will. So I was wondering if you could kind of walk through some questions with me about grief. So one of the first questions I have is, what are the stages of grief, and do people move through those stages? I think there's 4 or 5. And do people move through those stages linearly, or is it kind of all over the place, or is it different for every person? I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We could spend the whole time talking about that today.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure.
and when I think about grief, I think about, Dougy Center, we serve people who've had someone in their life die, or if someone has an advanced serious illness. But grief can occur when there's any type of transition or loss. And these can be losses and transitions that could also be seen as positive. When you think about somebody getting married or having a child or graduating from high school, those are all seen as positive transitions in our lives, but they often come with grief because there's some kind of transition. So anytime there's a big change in our life, grief can come up. And because as people, we like to know what to do and how to do it, oftentimes we're searching for the step-by-step process. And so I think the stages of grief, which were developed by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, they were based on her research that she did with people in hospitals who were dying. So these were patients with advanced terminal illnesses. And she, in her research of talking to them, discovered these different phases and emotions and feelings that they were going through. And while she worked to adapt those to the idea of having had someone die, in the end of it, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was like, I kind of wish that hadn't happened, because it's been put upon people as, here's this recipe to follow,
Yeah.
where you like, I don't even remember them anymore, but like you bargain about stuff and then you get really mad about stuff and then you get really sad about stuff and then you're supposed to accept it, whatever that means in terms of grief. And then ding ding, you like, your cake is done, you're finished with grief, you have healed, move on. And so we see a lot of people struggling with this idea of moving from one linear stage to the next in grief, where it just doesn't work that way. The stages of grief are their emotions, their thought processes, their experiences people have, but they definitely don't unfold in any kind of linear progression. And not everyone feels all those things. I've had parents call me and say, my kid hasn't gotten angry yet. I don't know if he's actually grieving the right way. And I say, anger is not part of grief for everyone. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Some people really struggle with sadness, and some people don't. And so I think anything we can do to acknowledge that grief contains a multitude of reactions and emotions and thoughts and questions and behaviors, and not be looking for a recipe to follow in our grief.
Yeah. So it sounds really like also with any transition, there could be an associated value, if you will, of grief attached to that. And so whether it be, as you say, some positive transitions, moving into a new position at work, or maybe moving into a new house, or there's always some sort of value attached to what you're moving from into what you're moving to, and positive or negative. And it sounds like there's a certain value that each person has to maybe identify with in their own way. So, and it doesn't sound like there's a recipe or that it's a straight line, that it's just how people grieve is really individual to them.
Yeah, and a lot of that gets determined by so many factors, whether that's what we were raised to know or believe to be true about grief, what we saw our families teach us about how we navigate transitions, what our access is to time and space. If we have two jobs and we have no time to be connecting with those thoughts and those feelings of those loss and that transition, that's going to be a very different experience than someone that maybe has the ability to take time off of work or to engage in some other practices to support themselves. So grief really does look different for everyone for so many factors: our age, who it is that has died, or what the loss is, what we've learned about grief and loss. Everything goes into contributing to this very unique grief reaction.
Right. And I think it's interesting too, especially when we think about grief with kids. I think as a parent, I know that can be a really scary topic for parents to try to figure out how to navigate and talk to their kids. Do you have any ways that might make it easier to do this when speaking about grief with children?
Yeah, it's such a great point. Like, as a parent or as an adult, a caregiver, a family friend, like, it's one of the hardest things we think about doing is telling our child that maybe someone in their life has died and helping support them through that process. And it's often because we don't necessarily know what we need in our grief too. So we're already feeling pretty overwhelmed. So I think oftentimes the first thing is like, what are your support services? Who can you turn to? Who can you talk to, so that you're in a pretty resourced place to support your kids and your teens? And, I think one of the basic primary urges as adults and caregivers we might have is to protect kids. And that can look like not telling them or avoiding telling them or not telling them the whole truth of what has happened. And we really encourage families, to the best of their ability, to be honest with kids, because giving kids a short, simple explanation of what's happened and letting them ask whatever questions they might have about that just goes a long way to cut down on any extra time or energy they're spending trying to figure out what happened. And it's not uncommon for kids to know, even though adults in their life haven't told them. They may have already been sensing, like they're hearing people on the phone a lot, they're watching their adults cry, they're noticing tension in the household. They've heard something, but they don't really know what it means. And you sometimes end up in a situation where a kid knows that someone has died, but the adults in their life haven't told them. And so they are now feeling like they have to protect the adult because they think the
Right.
adult doesn't know. And so wanting to avoid that, or kids hear it from someone else,
Yeah.
and then I think as a parent, like I want to be the person telling my
Sure.
child what has happened, in the words that they can understand. So we say start with a simple explanation in words that they can understand that are appropriate for where your kiddo is developmentally. And then saying, I really wanted you to know this news. It can be really sad. It can be really hard. You might not even know what to feel right now. What
Yeah.
questions do you have? And let your
Okay.
kids ask those questions, and that guides what other details you might share with them.
So, sure. So just being brave and keeping it simple, keeping it very clear and honest, and allowing some space for some dialogue with your kids about it. Lots of questions.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
think with younger kids too, and this is helpful, I think, for teenagers and adults too, is to avoid using some of the language we might use to feels like maybe we're softening up the reality. And so oftentimes people will say, we lost someone, or they passed away, or they're gone. As adults, we know what that means, but younger kids, they're such concrete thinkers. They're like,
Sure.
well, I lost my teddy bear. How come we can't go find grandpa? Or what do you mean they're gone? Things are gone and then they come back. And that can also kick up some fear and anxiety for kids because they don't really know what you're talking about. So we really encourage people, as hard as it is to say the words, to say, honey, I've got really sad news. Grandpa died last night. His heart stopped working. The doctors tried to fix his heart and they couldn't. And so that means his body stopped working. He's not going to be sleeping anymore or eating anymore. We won't be able to see him or hug him, but we'll always have photos and memories and, this special shirt that you got from grandpa. But just to help kids really distinguish between something being gone, lost, and someone has actually died.
That makes a lot of sense. So, in thinking about this as well, what comes up for me is how best to support people, not just children, but adults maybe through the grieving process. Like, is there, I don't want to ask for a recipe because I know there's not a recipe for grief, but is there a best practices sort of way to support people right at the time of the death, or in a month, or maybe 6 months or a year? Is there any thoughts about that?
Well, I really appreciate you setting up like at the moment, a few months later, and a year later, because I think starting there is so important that oftentimes when someone dies, there's a rush of support in the first few days or first few weeks. And then that goes away over time. And so the person who is grieving is left feeling a little bit isolated or alone in their experience. And that can come from maybe an idea that grief has a timeline or an expiration date. And so remembering that grief is something we carry with us the rest of our lives. It doesn't always feel the same, but there's no endpoint for grief. So just thinking ahead, like you don't have to do it all in the first 2 weeks. If you're wanting to show up for a friend or a family member who's had someone die, that you can be that person who shows up over the longer term. So some things that come to mind are, like I said, with kids, being really open and honest, providing opportunities for people to ask questions, and then to really just listen. I think so much when it comes to grief, it's about what we receive and what we are present for, and less about what we do and say. So for me, I'm thinking about what's the least amount of words I can use to show up and just be there for someone and listen and give them an opportunity to share what's happening for them, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Sometimes though, there may be friends or family who they have folks who can listen to them, or they're not really folks who want to talk about their grief. So what are some other ways we can show up in more concrete options? Like, hey, I'm about to run to the grocery store. Can I pick anything up for you? I'll just drop it on your front porch. Or, I'm getting ready to do a bunch of yard work this weekend. I could easily just run the mower over and do your grass if you'd like. Or can I take the kids for a night? Or I know our kids are on the same soccer team. Can I give your kids a ride there and back? Thinking about the fact that grief takes such a toll on us physically, on our minds, on our bodies, on our energy levels, that oftentimes just stepping in to help with those more tangible things can be really, really helpful.
Mhm.
And then it's always great to kind of avoid the more platitudey place that we can go in grief.
So I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, is there anything that we should veer away from in terms of supporting someone and a child? We've had a lot of good ideas going back and forth right now about how to support someone in a variety of ways. But is there anything that we really shouldn't do?
This one's so tricky to answer because everybody's so different, right? So if I
Yeah.
say most of the kids and the teens that I work with do not appreciate phrases like they're in a better place, or at
Mm,
least they're out of pain, or at least you had a good relationship with them, or at least you got to say goodbye. Sort of that classic thing that some folks might be familiar with Brene Brown of saying, like, any statement that starts with at least usually isn't going to land in a really supportive way, because it's kind of like, don't complain about what's going on for you because at least you had this thing
right,
happen. So I try
right.
to avoid saying anything with at least. And to not make assumptions about the relationship the person had. You know, you may have a child or a teen, and oh, you must be so sad or you must be so brokenhearted. And maybe that child or teen isn't feeling that way about the person who died. And then that could spark some guilt or regret of how they're not reacting. I think sometimes when there's ways that we come to make meaning or understanding of having someone in our life die, and that could be related to our religious background, our spiritual beliefs. It could be all kinds of things. But if we take that and put it on someone else, that doesn't always land as well. So sometimes just asking, like, how are you feeling about this? Or what are you thinking about? And just supporting them in whatever they're thinking.
Yeah.
Um,
So being really careful not to diminish another person's experience by not using those catch-all phrases at least. Um, and being really mindful of waiting, it sounds like, for the person to sort of direct us and let them tell us what they need.
Yeah, another one that stands out to me that was really a surprise to me, and I'm sure I've been in the field for 19 years, and I'm sure 18 and a half of them, I kept saying this to people, and I've learned from kids and teens that oftentimes our instinct is to say, "You're so strong. I can't believe how you're handling this. I could never imagine what you're going through. I couldn't do what you're doing." And I've heard from a lot of folks that that often feels like, one, now they have to be strong because people are
Mhm.
seeing them as strong. Also, what does strong mean? And they may not feel very strong on the inside, but now that people are saying, "Oh, you look so strong," there's maybe not enough space to say, "Let me show you the side of me that doesn't feel so strong."
Right.
So I'm working to get that out of my vocabulary of, "You're so strong." Unless someone says, "I feel so strong, I'm so proud of myself," then I'll be like, "That's amazing, you're so strong, you're proud of yourself," but I wouldn't put that on them.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, maybe sort of our um, perception of the situation, which doesn't necessarily match with the person who's grieving.
Yeah. Oh, and then
Okay.
you had asked, like, over the long term, and
Uh-huh.
I think trying to remember significant dates can really be meaningful. So if it's the anniversary of when someone has died, or if it's a wedding anniversary, if it was a person's partner or spouse who died, if it's a birthday, just those significant days, sometimes just putting a little reminder in your calendar to reach out to that person just to say, "Hey, I'm thinking about you today." Not that they have to respond or say anything. And also knowing that the weeks leading up to those significant days oftentimes can be the hardest, and the day itself doesn't feel as hard as people maybe expected it to. So thinking ahead, like we just had Mother's Day this last weekend, Father's Day is coming up, just having that kind of on the radar, even if it's been 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, just to reach out to say, "I was just thinking about you today and hoping you get the support that you need."
Right. Great. And I think one of my biggest questions is how can we best support our community when a significant portion of our community is grieving? How can we best do that?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer because you've got this multitude of people who all grieve differently,
Yeah.
but they're grieving as a community, and then each community has its own unique character and culture and traditions. So I think sometimes just starting with having an awareness of, like, wow, our community has been through a lot, whether it's because of the pandemic or a number of deaths in the community. Sometimes there can be an economic situation that's creating a lot of grief and loss for folks. So I think sometimes just having that awareness that it's happening,
Mhm.
and then remembering to check in with people to just say, like, "I've just been thinking a lot about the situation and just wondering how are things going for you? Is there anything I can be, is there anything that I can?" Well, I'm going to stop myself because our habit is to say, "Let me know if I can do anything," which oftentimes is not super helpful. But just to even connect with other community members to say, "I'm just aware that, like, 5 people in our neighborhood are really grieving right now. I wonder what we could do together." And building that support. And sometimes it's less about what we do and more about the perception that people are willing and ready and able to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something else. Let me see if it's going to be in there. Let me see if it comes back. Oh, I think oftentimes when there's maybe there's a family who's had a death or a number of families, and there can be a lot of like, let's get a meal train going, let's get this going, let's get that going. And those things are all really helpful and supportive. And sometimes offloading the organization of that away from the person who's directly affected to another community member. So that's a way that people can really help their community to say, we've got 3 families in our elementary school who are grieving. I'm going to take charge of organizing this meal train, and then can someone else help me figure out how we're going to get this food out to these folks and things like that.
Okay. Okay. Those are great suggestions. I don't know that I have any other questions, but as we were talking, I'm just curious if anything was coming up for you in terms of thinking about this grief process and maybe thinking about anything that we haven't addressed in my questions to you yet.
I just think a lot about the power of naming what's happening for us. And so inviting folks to really think about what are the transitions that you've gone through in the last year or 2 years that have created some sense of loss. And has there been an opportunity to just recognize, like, oh, I'm grieving. I'm grieving that I had to move. I'm grieving that I didn't get to go to my kids' high school graduation. I'm grieving that I missed out on 5 months of visits with my grandkids. I'm grieving all kinds of things. And so sometimes just naming it can go a long way. And then thinking through, like, what might you need to do to acknowledge that loss, whether it's creating some kind of ritual or some kind of ceremony. And that can be something really small. It could just be setting up all the photos of your grandkids and saying little messages of all the things you would have wanted to do in person, and just acknowledging the things that you weren't able to do in person. And also sometimes creating specific times to just be with the grief, whatever emotions are coming up. Oftentimes we stay so busy and we're like, I don't want to think or feel that. I don't want to think or feel that. And then it lets you know you need to think or feel it, sometimes in really inconvenient moments. And so sometimes just scheduling time every week to just journal or just think or sit in the garden or do something physical with the intention of, like, I'm just acknowledging all the losses that have happened, can help it not come up when you're walking down the grocery store
Least
aisle.
expecting it. Yeah.
Not that it won't happen then too, but
True. But yeah, I find that so many people that I talk to about grief actually say that, oh my gosh, it just hit me like a ton of bricks in the middle of the grocery store. And here I am standing and bawling. And I can't even think about what I actually need that's on my list that I'm holding because I crumpled it up in my fist, And we've talked about that, like when those big feelings come up, instead of stuffing them, to just allow you to have space to go ahead and experience those. Because I think when people stuff that grief over time, it ends up bubbling up in some other area at some point in their lives. And so I think for me, when thinking about grieving, I really do try to encourage people to just walk through that and have the courage to just sit and feel those emotions or those thoughts. I feel like if you don't, it'll come out at some point. We just don't know when, as you're saying.
right. And I think too, sometimes when those feelings do come up, is just rather than the thought of, like, why am I feeling this way? Sometimes it's, of course I'm feeling this way. A lot has happened. Of course this is happening, and that can help decrease this judgment we might have about ourselves. Of, like, it's been 5 years. I can't believe I'm crying about this in the grocery store aisle, or it's been 10 years. I can't believe I'm still thinking about this. And so giving some space to ourselves of, like, we loved and cared about this person. Time doesn't really make a difference in that. Of course I'm going to be thinking about them. Of course I'm going to be missing them, especially as I hit different milestones in my life. So if you were 15 when your parent died, and then you turn the age they were when they died, it makes so much sense that you'd have a lot of emotion that comes up. And you don't have to do it in a stereotypical way of, like, sitting and crying, right? You can be doing something with that emotion. You can be talking to someone, you can be creating a project, but just being intentional about it and being like, yeah, I'm attending to my grief in whatever it is that I'm doing right now.
Yeah. I think those are really, really fantastic points. If a person wanted to access the Dougy Center online, how would they do that?
The best place to go is our website, which is dougy.org. And then we have a brand new website, thankfully, much easier to navigate than our old one. So it should be really easy to find our tip sheets, our podcast, which is called Grief Out Loud, our workbooks, our guidebooks, and our activity sheets. There's different ways to search on the website. You could put in what age you're looking for resources related to. You could put in who died and how that person died. You can also just look for a specific type of resource. So that's a great place to start. If you're looking for resources in your local community, you can always call us or email us and we can try to work with you on that. And if you just have a question, if you want a little consultation about, it's my son died and I'm really worried about my grandkids and I'm wondering what resources are available, you can just call us. And our phone number is 503-775-5683. And we're Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Pacific Standard Time. And we're happy to kind of talk through and help you find those resources too.
Excellent. Well, I really, really appreciate your time, Jana. And I'm hoping that this is going to be really helpful for our community and just understanding how many more resources there are outside of Center for Wellness that they can access. So again, I appreciate your time and the Dougy Center, and just letting everyone know too that Jana was able to send us quite a few of the workbooks and sheets that she's talking about. And so we have those available for you at any time to pick up at the front office at Wallowa Valley Center for Wellness.
Thanks, Chantay, for having me. And
thank
thanks
you,
everyone, for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.